Hey, welcome in everybody. Glad you made it to the Q&A for Tier 3 on day 3. How you doing, Madeline?
I'm doing good. It's Wednesday, it's all downhill from here.
yeah. Well,
Hard
I
part
feel
of the
like it's
week's
just,
done.
I feel like it's ramping up. I don't know about you. It's good to see people dropping in. Let's see here. Well, I think we got a question for them as they enter.
Yeah, so if you're here and you're situated, just go ahead and drop in the chat where you're joining from and what you're excited about related to day 3, tier 3.
Yeah, and those that are just joining, we're gonna cover a few slides, get into some questions and answers, and wrap up this, well, hopefully it was a full day for you or a full couple days as you get to participate in those asynchronous videos. Right. We'll give it just another minute. So again, if you're just joining, drop in the chat where you're joining us from. What got you excited about day 3, tier 3? Right. Now, what got you excited?
All the people were so great. I think I really liked the panel a lot and just listening to their real world experiences of trying to get tier 3 up and running and working for kids in schools. I think that was probably the thing that I liked the most that I saw from the content. What about you?
Oh, I'd agree. I think that the panel was great. A lot of great sort of like one-liners. I'm like, oh, I wish I would have had that in my back pocket when I was talking with people. I would have pulled that out every time. And so much of it was around that idea of like, where are students going and why is it a place that exists? Why is it a destination? I think that's an interesting conversation that maybe we'll come back to. But it definitely stood out to me. And Jess, thanks for dropping in the chat. Where are you from? San Diego. Good to see you. And how to improve. Hey, aloha.
Hawaii.
Right. It's exciting.
Hawaii, California.
Well, we're a minute past the 3:30 mark, which is where I'm at. It could be 4:30 for you, could be 5:30, could be lots of times, depending on where you're joining from around the world. But for me, it's here in Colorado Springs. Madeline's joining from Minnesota. I'm probably got sunshine and Madeline probably got clouds.
That's true. You are correct.
That's right. Oh, look at that, Mexico. That's great.
Oh, awesome.
So what we're going to do real quick is just turn our attention to this idea of what was or what is tier 3. And we like to define tier 3 as individualized supports for a few students who have needs that require intensive interventions that cannot be addressed at the tier 1 and tier 2 level. And as you heard us talking about earlier, we were joined on day 3 by wonderful guests, Dr. Sharon Hoover, Dr. Chris Borgmeyer, Rachel Barrett, and Dr. Janika Newbill and Shania Bowman. The last 3 were in the panel that we were just referencing. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out yet and you're just now joining us, they make up the panel and you got individual discussions with Dr. Sharon Hoover and Dr. Chris Borgmeyer. Here at Character Strong, we like to think of this as a whole child approach. It's not just about one single element that might be impacting the child's ability to learn inside their school environment, their classroom, or outside of it. So we think about it again through the regular triangle, right? Here it is, universal for all. Every student's getting it. That's probably going to address the needs of 80 to 90% of students. And we're going to address those through the academic means. We're going to address that through school-wide behavioral expectations. We're going to talk about relationships and how they successfully establish them, maintain them, restore them through that universal tier 1 practice. And then we're going to create some means of universal screening to address the gaps that might exist, the lagging skills that students have, and be able to identify them. Because if we don't know that students have a need, then we're incorrectly serving them both in tier 1, but also not giving them the tier 2 supports. So when we think about tier 2, again, that's a selected group of students. 10 to 20% of your school might fall into that category. You heard, if you joined yesterday's Q&A, what that looked like from Megan and Clay. And now we're talking about targeted intensive interventions for few. I like to think about this in the small elementary schools. Hopefully that's only 1 to 5 students that you're having to provide targeted intensive interventions for. And those could be around medical needs, those could be around wraparound service supports, could be intensive academic interventions, or individualized behavior and mental health services that allow them to access learning at a higher level so they can be successful both in school and beyond. And so we just want to cover a few more things to bring us full circle before we jump into some questions. But when we talk about tier 3, when we're looking at academics, it is about literacy and mathematics. It's also about other subject areas that might be a challenge for students to access the content and perform the way we expect them to. But really those instructional interventions are 4 to 5 weeks or 4 to 5 times per week that we're providing above and beyond what's happening at the tier 1 level, or potentially above what they already received at the tier 2 intervention. When you look at behaviors, we're starting to talk about functional behavior intervention plans, behavior intervention plans that allow us to actually correctly identify what those specific antecedents are. So those things that are going on for them that are triggering them as they come into our school settings, and creating strategies for themselves, but also for the adults to be able to support them through their intervention, but also reinforce the behaviors that we want to see inside the classroom and outside of it, in the hallways, in the cafeteria, on the playground, and everywhere else. We also know students have social emotional needs. So we might be looking at cognitive behavior therapy. We're actually delivering psychoeducation, where we're teaching specific skills around emotional regulation, around cognitive restructuring, but also having them think and pause and identify what it is that's going on for them, so they're able to actually then enact the behavior that they want and that seems to be relevant and accurate for that environment. And ultimately too, we want to support families. How is it that we come to wrap ourselves around the student, both from the school perspective, but also from, thank you for the little note. You kept hearing some sweet music there. Sorry, that was drowning me out, but we'll get that turned down for you. And so really, when we think about those family interventions, how is it that we're wrapping ourselves around that, including the family, including external services, but also the school, because it does take a family, community, and partnership to really drive what we expect from the behaviors that we want to see for students. And so that sort of brings us full circle of like, what is tier 3? You heard from the panelists. We'd love to hear what questions you might have for Madeline and I regarding tier 3, regarding what you heard. It could be around the summit. It could be just around tier 3 practices. It could be your own next steps. And that would be important as well to ask questions about. So feel free to drop it in the chat, what questions come to mind. And as you're thinking of things, Madeline, I think you had some wonderings as you watched some of those videos.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when I've worked in tier 2, and whether it's like consulting with school systems on how they develop that level of support for students, or actually being the one that delivers the tier 3 supports, the thing that really hit me the most in practice, and still does, and they touched on this in Sharon's talk, Dr. Hoover's talk, and Dr. Bormeyer's talk, and also in the panel, is just workforce competence and ability to deliver this level of care and support to students who have really individualized needs that go beyond what a lot of schools have the capacity or the training or the really resources that are packaged for schools to deliver. And so I think that's a big wondering of mine, about like, how do we do that? How do we support workforce development internally to kind of build internal capacity to deliver tier 3 services? Because a lot of times the model right now is kind of contracting out or referring out, and sometimes that doesn't really work. Research shows that sometimes that ends up not being a sustainable solution, or for some kids, it's not the most effective way to kind of wrap around them and support their individualized needs. So Cory, if you have any thoughts there, I would love to hear. your insights. I
Yeah.
know I have some, but
Yeah, I want to hear yours too for sure. I think when I think about it, when we talk about like external supports, I get more concerned about how they're actually integrated into the system. To your point, they often become a siloed support mechanism that we just refer into, and then there's no continuity or continuum of care from that external provider into the school. And so our teachers are really unaware of what they should be reinforcing, what practices are really effective for supporting that student. And they essentially have no role clarity or competency around what it is that that intervention is supposed to do to for that student. And so
mhm,
when we can start to find ways, if we have to, and I think there's some reasons to do that, to have some type of memorandum of understanding with an outside partner to come in and support because there's limited capacity at times for specific needs, then how do we actually create them to be a part of our teaming processes, so
mhm.
they're coming in and sharing what's happening with the school psychologist, the counselor, the social worker, whatever whoever's on that tier 2 team is, and so they can actually build out really successful plans that allow that student to thrive. But when they continue just to stay on the side, I think then we run into issues that we often see is like, well, the therapist might say they do great in therapy. You're like, absolutely.
Mhm.
Most students, in my experience, do really well one-on-one.
Yeah.
And then the problem exists is in the environment that's triggering them for whatever reason. And we don't ever have that two-way communication that's vital for students to be successful. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. And we got a question from Jess too coming up.
Yeah, I think like what you hit on too is another wondering of mine is kind of that like how do we get tier 3 from being a place that exists outside the rest of the system of support and it to actually be part of the system of support and like everybody has stake in tier 3 support because it does require multiple stakeholders and multiple people and supports within the context and skill building outside of the context that then you can push in and kind of reinforce and cue and practice and build up over time. And so that definitely resonates with me, all that you're saying about, workforce competence and also making sure that it's not just you take a kid out and put them in one-on-one and then put them back in their setting and expect them to magically do better. That's not
Yeah.
oftentimes going to work very well.
Uh,
So let's go to Jess's question in the chat. You want me to read it?
yeah, go ahead.
All right. So Jess says, one of the things I noticed is that there is very little content for online schools and independent study schools. Do you have any suggestions or resources that can help in this area? We've built our MTSS structure from scratch because we have a virtual independent study high school. Are there ways to adapt the classroom supports for online students? This is an awesome question.
Yeah.
And this like rubber hit the road in COVID. I was delivering school-based supports when COVID started in person and then
Yeah.
everything shut down, but we had to continue service delivery online. And we were like, oh my gosh, nothing was built for this system. So this is like a new thing that's coming up that, I mean, a lot of programs just don't have the capacity to rapidly turn around new content for different contextual constraints like are coming up right now. Cory, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I was getting excited to hear what you guys did when you
Okay,
were in that space.
well, I can do it. So we did it online. I mean, we took a lot of the stuff that we were doing. So I was a school-based therapist back a while ago. And I was doing cognitive behavioral therapy with kids and then also doing, push and consultative support to teachers. And all of that had to go online. And there's been some really good research that happened during that period of time that shows that you can effectively take a program that you deliver in person and take it online, and it does really well. There's also some really good training supports for like how do you deliver one-on-one interventions with students online and make it engaging and it be like a quality intervention that you can deliver. So specifically for tier 3 and even for tier 2, I mean, if you've got small groups and things like that that you want to be delivering online, there's some really great resources. Oh, specifically through, I'll have to dig them up. But I want to say Medical University of South Carolina. They are the trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy group, and they've got some really good supports on how to deliver one on one services or group services online. And they have actual like training modules you can go through to like figure out how to do online service delivery with the stuff that you already have that you can deliver one-on-one in person or in groups in person, and just taking some skills that specifically translate those things to an online platform. And then there's lots of research to show that it's still effective, even if it's online. So even if you feel awkward, I know I did when I started it, and I was like, this is not gonna go well. There's no way that this is gonna be as effective as in person. I had some of the best success with my online interventions during that period of time. And it allowed for people to have access who would not have accessed any type of support. And we still did teacher consultation online. We still talked about, how do you do group contingency online? How do you improve engagement? How do you make sure that people are engaged? Because that was a huge issue when we went online, was students just kind of checked out. So there's lots of supports online to figure out how to do that. And I can dig those up and we can send them out in some way, shape, or form. But that was my experience. Cory, did you have anything to add?
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking, and Jess maybe has already done this, but I think when we move into this space, whether it's by force, right, or because that's the type of learning environment that you have and you work for, then making sure it's the right fit, just like any other type of service provider that would provide or supports you'd provide for a student. Not every student is the right fit for that type of intervention. There might be a better
Mm-hmm.
intervention that we might want to look towards. So sometimes it's identifying like the current resources that I have a menu to select from actually are not broad enough or would allow me to utilize them effectively. And so sometimes it is going out and looking for new specific resources that
Mm-hmm.
are tailored or more conducive for an online space. But equally too, the student then setting them up for success, really about like, well, what is the expectation? How do we engage, and how do we going to work together in this space up front? Because I think sometimes we just launch in, like students gets referred. We sometimes have a relationship, sometimes we don't, but we got to provide this support. We launch right in without teaching first, helping students understand like what does it look like to operate in this space if they're not used to it or not used to having that
Mm-hmm.
type of intervention support online. And so
Yeah.
setting them up in those pre-sessions, those pre-conference work before even
Oh,
going
yeah.
to the intervention really, I think, becomes vital and necessary for the virtual space. So you get the
Yeah.
most out of that experience as quickly as possible instead
Yeah.
of norm yourself out.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That is huge, hugely helpful. And I did just look in my drive at all of my online therapy and telehealth resource stuff. And MUSC, Medical University of South Carolina, does have a telehealth guide and like online module you can go through, and they talk about stuff like that, like setting up norms and like how do you do all of this stuff online? How do you interact with adolescents and youth and kids online and be effective in your work with them. So I would definitely check that out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what we've been often talking about too, Madeline and I at least, is that, you know, trying to find a network or hub for continually uh, improving upon learning about other interventions becomes necessary. And so I love the conversation happening in the chat right now. It's like, hey, I got a resource, can I share it? Sometimes we just don't know everything that's out there. It's hard
Yeah.
to there only may exist in a region of the country I'd never even think about. And so finding yourself into spaces like this and sharing resources becomes essential, I think, for deriving sort of improvement practice work related to tier 3 supports and interventions, whether it's online or whether it's in person.
Yeah, definitely. That was one thing that I thought of when we were talking about workforce development. Like, I remember when I was practicing in schools, having like a group of people who were doing the same type of thing that I was doing that I could just bounce ideas off of, or email to ask for help, or brainstorm with, or get on a call regularly, like once a month, to talk about what we're doing in practice and how, like, my things that I needed help figuring out. That was hugely helpful because in schools, a lot of times we don't have that. We don't have a supervisor, like a clinical supervisor who's coming in and helping us figure out how to do the things that we do. We usually get training and we get a manual, and then we're told, go find kids that need this thing and do it. And then when you, like, rubber hits the road, you have a student in your office or online and you're trying to do the thing that you've learned how to do. It's hard to figure out all of the little things that you need to do and all the tips and tricks that other people have probably already worked out that make it run so much more smoothly, especially with these kids who are they're savvy kids. Like, they know how to navigate a situation. And so being able to have other professionals that you can reach out to and lean on, is super helpful.
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. I was just reading the chat there. I think, with changing leadership, that's a reality too. And when I just think about that, how many educators have left the profession, how many have been elevated up into those leadership roles that may not have as much experience in this space around tier 3 supports. What does it mean? Well, sometimes it seems like we're sending everyone right to tier 3 first. And I'm just thinking through that and related to that comment, Madeline, how do you think about tier 3, like, referrals or tier 3 access points for both staff to have a structured referral process, but also equally identifying the best fit? What did that look like for you in your own work?
Yeah, so I think this also goes to Charlie's point about changing leadership. I mean, I think the best way to dial in your, like, accuracy with, teachers filling out surveys even, or being able to identify kids who are struggling and what level of need they have, is education. Like, pushing out and providing people with professional learning around the things that you are able to deliver, so that you can help them match kids early to these interventions and be kind of informed consumers. So even with leadership changing year to year, I know in the schools that I worked in as a practitioner, or schools that I've consulted with, we do really strategic education early on with new leadership about what we can offer at each level of support, because a lot of times coming in, they have no idea what's already been set up and what's available, and they're not informed consumers of what's in their own system. And once they learn that, they're like, oh, wow, we have a lot of supports. Like, I remember people were shocked that I delivered cognitive behavioral therapy and had a really healthy caseload. They were like, we have that in our school? I had no idea. So just being able to go out and teach people about the things that you're equipped to do at each level of support is super helpful. And then for teachers in that identification process, I think doing education around, mental health literacy, like, what does anxiety look like? What does depression look like at different kind of like age points or developmental periods? What does, trauma look like? PTSD and trauma can look like ADHD, and a lot of people don't know that. So then they're like, well, this kid just doesn't attend in class, but really there's a lot of stuff happening underneath the surface of that iceberg that's really kind of triggering that signal of behavior. So really souping your staff and your leadership up with knowledge about mental health, and about the services that you can provide and that are available within the school, I think is like a great first step in creating an informed and collaborative source of support across the system. And that kind of also goes to that comment about, like, tier 3 is not a place. Everybody has stake in working with kids who have the most individualized, complex pretty heavy needs that they're bringing into school. And so being able to educate people about all of that and then having an understanding and a lens of that understanding when they go into the classroom and they interact with students and they fill out surveys and they come to team meetings about what's going on can really speed up the process, because you're not kind of just like hitting a brick wall every time and missing the mark on things because people don't know what they don't know. I mean, like, honestly, like, they just have no idea. You take the blinders off of them and they're so much better able to articulate what's going on so that you can better serve that child in the moment and that family in the moment. So I think that's like one of the best first steps to get the ball rolling in my experience.
Yeah, I love that idea of like developing mental health literacy, but and then on top of it, having some form of asset map, resource map that's available both at your school, but what's being maybe through an itinerant support professional coming in, like what are those
Mm-hmm.
resources? And I think when the more people have the language to describe what they're seeing more accurately, to your point, we can match students to the best intervention, and we probably have access to it. We just don't, one, know that they're there, and two, we don't know how to correctly describe what we're seeing. So, I mean, and we do our best to try to make sense of what that is, but giving people the language to do that makes them feel more confident in their ability to sit in those meetings and have
Yeah.
rich dialogue about how we're going to create better interventions and supports for any given student, because they are complex challenges and
Yeah.
we're faced with at tier 3.
Yeah. And there's research that shows that teachers are some of the best reporters. They are some of the most accurate and some of the best reporters of anybody that interfaces with the child. They just need to know what they need to be looking for. They're really good at looking for stuff and they're really perceptive. They can be some of your biggest champions and like really speed up the process and really become a partner in the work with you. It's just really equipping them with the information that they need to hit the ground running on that. So I think a lot of teachers really welcome it because they're seeing it so much in their classroom. They just don't know what it is and they don't know what to do. And so like knowledge is power, being able to like name it to tame it is really helpful. So I've seen that work super well. It looks like there's a question in the chat that Felicia just put in.
Yeah.
I'll read it. It says, our elementary MTSS is moving forward, but we are struggling with high school MTSS process. What would you recommend for trying to push MTSS into the high school level? Cory?
Yeah. I mean, that's a common challenge, one we hear a lot, primarily because those staff members spend less time with a student than what they'd see in elementary school. The first and foremost, I think, is one, developing a team that's actually going to be dedicated to doing the work in our schools related to MTSS. Sometimes we create more teams than we need to, and people have like team fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only so many hours after school that people can attend it. However, what team makes the most sense to take up this effort, and then equipping them with a process by which we're able to then identify students. We were talking about it earlier, like, well, what is the universal screening process where we're able to identify students that aren't getting their needs met at tier 1? And if we don't have a process, then I think we need to actually start thinking about, well, what can we do to identify those students? Because what's wonderful, I think, about the universal screener at the tier 1 level is that not only does it tell you where student needs are, but it also helps you define how successful your tier 1 practices currently are. Because at some point, we're probably going to have to address, either at the classroom level or the school-wide effort, universal tier 1 supports and intervention strategies. And so if we don't know what those are and they're not being adhered to regularly, then of course we're going to have a lot more students needing tier 2 or tier 3 supports based on these universal screeners. And so using those instruments to be able to identify the need. What's challenging with them, though, equally, is it doesn't tell you what to do next oftentimes. And so it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, I know there's a need now, but what are we going to do? And
Yeah,
so
I was just thinking
yeah,
that.
yeah. So that's where that
Yeah,
team
yeah,
comes in. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I think too, like in my experience with high schoolers and high school systems, like two of the big things to overcome are scheduling because you've got so many blocks and so many kids going different places. So that's like one place to start. And then the other thing with high schoolers, especially for tier 2 and tier 3, that I think so important is voice and choice, like centering them as people and that they have agency in like what they decide is best for them, because they are teenagers. They are like burgeoning adults. And one thing we need to teach them is how to be independent and like advocate for yourself and say what you need. So using something like a collaborative and proactive solutions process to really bring their voice into the process early, and then being able to provide choice with like what they want to do. Do they want to be in a group with other kids who might be struggling with the same problem? Do they want to have individual support, or do they want just access to resources and kind of being checked in on later at a later date? Some kids, that's all they can do because of their home situation. They can't get consent to be in anything other than what all kids are provided. And there's some really cool free resources. Dr. Jessica Schleider, she has developed these single session interventions that have shown some really good impact with depression and anxiety specifically, which probably are kids who have externalizing behavior, also are struggling with depression and anxiety. And those can be pushed out broadly. They're really focused on growth mindset and behavioral activation. So they're very skills focused. They're very proactive and positive, and they take less than 30 minutes. They're free, they're online. And that's a great resource for middle school and high school that like kids can access in their own time and do, and they're super effective.
Yeah.
High school is hard.
Really hard.
So things like that are helpful.
You certainly can take, and one things that you can do to sort of boost your knowledge is we have some upcoming on-demand professional development that's coming out here in mid to late March. One around mental health literacy, which Madeline, you were speaking to, another about adult SEL and the importance of having adults be well before they engage and work with students. Also whole student MTSS. And then what we were just talking about, like what are some low burden, high impact classroom strategies that actually allow us to provide supports that actually produce outcomes that we want for students. And also students feel good about being in school. They feel like they can belong and be successful there. I know that puts us right at 4:01, Madeline, right at the end of time, but we're really excited that everyone tuned in to the Not Your Typical MTSS Summit this year. This concludes our Q&A for day 3. Thanks, everybody.